Welcome to the Radix Review. Tune in each week as co-hosts Jay Denton and Chris Nebenzal cover the key trends in the apartment industry, macroeconomy, and much more. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today is July 3rd. We just wrapped up the first half of the year. First and foremost, before we get started, Jay, happy 4th of July. Happy 4th of July to everyone who's dialing in and listening to the podcast. Hopefully you're not listening to this podcast on the 4th of July, perhaps the day before or perhaps over the weekend. But anyway, happy 4th to all of those listening. Jay, what are we seeing in the market?
Chris, you just mentioned we wrapped up Q2, so we'll talk about kind of the end of the first half of the year, what we've seen so far play out in the multifamily industry. The latest round of job gains by metropolitan area were released recently. We'll go over kind of, again, it's not quite the midpoint for that report, but who have been some of the biggest gainers and maybe losers in terms of the job market this year, because we've heard the overall labor market's been strong, but it's different depending on metro area. And then I think we'll wrap up with the 4th of July. Hey, you see it in my jacket, you're wearing a 4th themed type shirt there. So we'll talk about what our plans are for the holiday week or weekend. But before we get into all that, Chris, why don't you give us a recap of the multifamily industry? What have we seen through the first half of this year?
Sounds good. So I took a look at our data year to date, January through the end of June. And one of the things that stuck out that really surprised me, look out, but there are a lot of West Coast markets that have performed very, very well this year. The West Coast, especially California, has been a market where demand has been slow. We've seen some pretty weak fundamentals over the past couple of years, certainly compared to what we saw in the Northeast, what we've seen in the Midwest. And not to say that the Northeast and Midwest are not doing well. In fact, there are two Midwestern markets that I'll point toward as doing quite well as well. But a lot of markets, San Jose, Portland, Oregon in certain metrics, Seattle, Riverside, San Diego, even San Francisco is starting to pop up towards the top of our year-to-date rankings. So, this industry is cyclical, as we know, and markets that perform well oftentimes cool down. Markets that have been struggling oftentimes find their footing. So, that was kind of the high-level trend. Let's dive into the numbers, starting with occupancy. So, occupancy, Minneapolis is one of the strongest performing markets. Occupancy is up about 1.5% year-to-date. And then we get Portland, Oregon, 1.3% growth in occupancy year to date. Again, when we've talked about the national occupancy rate rising 40 basis points, 30 basis points year to date, these markets are outperforming the national average by quite a bit, Minneapolis and Portland. And again, Portland was another one of those West Coast markets that have been struggling. Now, some of the markets that are cooling off, Tucson, Arizona, a very hot market last year and the year before, occupancy is down 1.2%. Tampa, Florida, occupancies are off about 40 basis points. Miami, occupancies are off about 20 basis points. So again, some of those Sunbelt metros starting to cool down. The good news there that we don't see all the way at the bottom of our rankings are some of those markets that we've talked a lot about. Austin, Nashville, Atlanta, their occupancies are pretty much flat. Austin occupancies up 10 basis points. I don't mean to be tongue in cheek, but 10 basis point growth in occupancy year to date in Austin, that is darn good based on what we've seen taking place across Austin. So overall, pretty good occupancy growth. Again, nationally, we're up about 30, 40 basis points. Some really strong growth in the Midwest, Minneapolis, Portland out west, San Jose in the top 5, Seattle in the top 10, Detroit in the top 10. And Detroit's a market we're going to talk a lot about in terms of rent growth and revenue growth as well. Detroit has really snuck up on me. So occupancies are growing. That's good news. And we'll probably start to see them plateau in the third quarter, but decent occupancy growth thus far this year. Jay, any comments on any of those markets that you've seen?
I would say it in some of them, and I'll talk about what we're seeing in the job situation next. Some of them, it makes a lot of sense given what we've seen in terms of job creation year to date. Austin has been one interesting that, again, at least if it can hold in there, I think that's strong. I think the general pattern that we've seen would be around traffic and traffic being down in certain places around the country. But I mean, you've been digging into some places where, again, some surprises where traffic's actually keeping up in places where you might not expect it.
Yeah, great segue. And so let's jump into traffic and leasing right now. Again, a lot of the markets that I wouldn't have necessarily thought would have high traffic. Sacramento leads all markets. Traffic is up 2.5 tours per property per week year to date. Good for 84% year to date traffic growth. Chicago, 69% traffic growth. Chicago continues to impress. Chicago traffic is above 10 tours per property per week. And then you get more California markets. Riverside, 62% year-to-date growth. San Diego, 55% year-to-date traffic growth. Reno, 49% traffic growth. All of those in the top 10 for year-to-date traffic growth. So again, the demand, I think, is returning to a lot of these Western markets, a lot of these California markets. I know Reno's not in California, but it often kind of pulls some traffic from the Sacramento area, perhaps even the Bay Area as well. So really strong traffic in the West Coast. And then again, Midwest market, Chicago holding its own, Minneapolis doing well as well. Where is the traffic falling? Vegas traffic has been pretty weak. Albuquerque, New Mexico traffic has declined. Jacksonville. But in fact, there were only 4 markets across the country where we've seen year-to-date traffic declines. Now that makes sense. This is, the first half of the year is typically when traffic increases. But considering the overall state of the market, it's good to see this demand continue. Traffic has continued to be robust in a lot of places. Looking at the leasing data, we see a little bit more of a southeastern influence on the leasing side. Orlando, Florida tops in the country with 73% leasing growth. They've added about 1.5 new leases signed per property per week since the beginning of the year. And Orlando is signing about 3.7 new leases each week. That's well within the top 5 for the country. Raleigh doing well with leasing growth. Greenville, South Carolina doing well in terms of leasing growth. But again, there you see Riverside, Sacramento, Minneapolis, markets that we talked about in some of the other metrics as well. So good leasing growth in a lot of these smaller markets. Again, with the exception of Chicago, you don't see a lot of big markets in here. We haven't mentioned Boston yet. We haven't mentioned LA. We haven't mentioned New York. We haven't mentioned San Francisco, the gateway markets. So really, it's kind of a secondary market story. Good growth in the West for leasing, good growth in the Southeast. But overall, it's been more of those secondary markets. Jay, any thoughts there?
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Again, and I won't touch on these as much when we look at the demand numbers via job growth, but typically that's what I'm seeing when I dig into labor market numbers as well. Is your smaller metropolitan areas tend to be showing a little bit stronger growth. So as an example, like a Fayetteville, Arkansas, with stronger growth, and some of those types. Even take a Boise as an example, or a Charleston, which I'll highlight in a minute. Tends to be some of those little bit smaller, as you've talked about before, satellite markets are the ones where we're seeing maybe a little bit better performance overall. So yeah, I would say many of those well correlated to what you're seeing there on the rent growth side.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more market that I'll call out in terms of leasing before we jump into net effective rent growth and RevPAR, kind of the key performance metrics. But San Francisco is a really interesting market. It lags all markets in terms of leasing growth. Leasing activity is down about 18% across the San Francisco MSA year to date. With that said, I recently took a look at 2 submarkets specifically in San Francisco, the downtown San Francisco submarket and what we call North Alameda, which is the downtown Oakland submarket. Both of those submarkets have leasing activity above 2.5 leases per property per week. That's double the MSA average and above the national average. And those are really 2 of the submarkets that have been hardest hit across the country. We had supply issues kind of early in the pandemic. We've had demand issues since the beginning of the pandemic. Certainly, we've all heard the stories of people leaving, companies leaving downtown San Francisco and Oakland. But really interesting to see the San Francisco MSA in total leasing is weak. But those 2 submarkets, leasing has been very, very strong. Certainly in May and June, but even going back to the beginning of the year. So perhaps a resurgence in some of those urban core submarkets in the Bay Area.
Yeah, and I would say, again, whether it's someone who's in ops, if you're in asset management, research, acquisitions, that's why it's always important to get more granular within the metropolitan area, whether it's a specific comp group or a submarket, just because we're seeing I'd say such a difference. And I mentioned this in our prior podcast when I was out at NAA, that when we would dig into these markets, you could, within one market, you could see completely different, results that you're trying to either benchmark to or underwrite a property. So it's so important to get to the level of specificity related to that area like you just gave.
That's right. That's right. So Jay, I'll wrap up this section talking about rent and revenue. What have we seen from net effective rent? Again, without repeating myself too many times, it's really the Midwest and the West Coast. San Jose, 7.6% year-to-date net effective rent growth. Detroit, Michigan, 7% year-to-date net effective rent growth. Really, really strong growth on the rent side. Seattle and Reno, 5.7 and 5.8% rent growth respectively. Those are both in the top 5. Portland, Oregon in the top 10. Las Vegas, 3.9% rent growth, rounding out the top 10. And Vegas was a market that we've seen really, really weak performance over the past couple of years. In fact, Vegas's annual rent growth year over year is only 70 basis points, yet year to date rents are up almost 4%. So Vegas seems to be on the comeback trail as well. Where are we seeing the weakest rent growth? Well, it's not surprising. It's the Southeast. Huntsville, Alabama, we've talked about a couple times in the Riot Report and on this podcast. Huntsville's a little like Austin, kind of tech-heavy, aerospace-heavy market with a lot of supply coming online. Greenville, South Carolina, struggling. Dallas and Austin are in the top 5 with negative 90 basis point and 110 basis point rent declines so far this year. So a lot of the markets that are grappling with new supply continue to be the markets struggling from a rent growth perspective. And then looking over at the revenue side of things, again, no surprise, similar markets. San Jose, revenue is up 8.9% year to date. Detroit, revenue per available unit is up 8.0% year to date. Seattle, Reno, Baltimore, Maryland is another one where we've seen a lot of steady growth in Baltimore across metrics. And Baltimore is kind of leading that mid-Atlantic resurgence. We've seen good performance in Virginia Beach and DC and a lot of areas as well. So again, to kind of wrap up what we're seeing nationally, the West Coast is really resurgent. The Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, parts of the Midwest doing well. A few markets specifically in the Midwest, Detroit, Chicago, Minneapolis, doing very, very well. And then those Southeastern markets that we've talked about lagging the way, but steady demand has kind of driven what I would consider slight outperformance. Again, things are still negative in a lot of the Southeast, a lot of the Sun Belt. But as we've talked about, be it with home sales, be it with continued immigration, be it with continued population growth, demand for housing is there, and it's really propping up the industry and the data that we've seen thus far through the first half of the year.
And just a reminder for those listening, if you hear some of those numbers and they sound really big, like 5% rent growth year to date or 7 or 8, keep in mind we're measuring from the beginning of the year when rents tend to hit their lowest actual level until now. And so usually from this point, or maybe a little bit later in the summer, rents will start to decline. So the better markets would still end the year on a year over year basis, maybe in that 3 to 4% range. Some might be higher than that, but the better markets this year, we expect for a full year growth to still be in maybe 2 to 4% range. A group of others closer to flat, which honestly, given how things have gone the last year plus, that's a good bounce back. And then, as you mentioned, I think the markets that are struggling that you worry about, that if rents are actually down right now compared to where they were at the beginning of this year, the fall and winter seasons tend to have slower traffic, occupancy starts to slide a little bit, rent growth then follows behind it. And so, it looks like 2024 is not the bounce back year for one set of markets, at least across the U.S.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jay. And just quickly referencing the year over year numbers at the beginning of July, Detroit leading the nation at 4.7%. So 7% year to date rent growth in Detroit, 4.5%, 4.7% year over year. Same thing with San Jose, 7.6% year to date, 3.3% year over year. So even in these hot markets, we are likely to see, as you mentioned, rents start to peel back a little bit in the coming months. So enough with the apartment market, Jay. I know you've kind of dived deep into the jobs numbers, specifically at the metro level. What can you tell us about the metropolitan jobs numbers?
Sure. I'll cover a few different angles. One, which which metros have added the most jobs so far this year? Obviously, the big guys. But on a growth perspective, where are we seeing the most relative performance? And then I'll wrap up with kind of changes from, we're not quite 6 months in, at least in terms of the reporting. So the reporting, all of this is going to be through May. So comparing the first 5 months of this year to how the last 5 months of last year finished, and which markets have maybe decelerated and which ones are kind of hanging in there overall, from that sort of demand metric that we follow. So let's start off with the biggest gains. Again, these are always going to be the largest metros out there typically. And, if you're in this part of the cycle. So New York, 5 months in from the beginning of the year now, they've added 70,000, 73,000, I think is the actual number of jobs. Washington, D.C., and by the way, New York, as we mentioned, one of the better performing on the rent growth and occupancy sides of the equation. Washington, D.C. is one of that. It's been a leader, so far this year. If we look year to date, 32,000 jobs added so far this year. That's a very, very solid number. Again, election year, so you probably have a whole lot of people roaming around D.C., throughout this year. Next, you got a couple Texas markets. So Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth, both roughly around 30,000. Again, Houston doing a bit better on the apartment market side right now than Dallas is. And then wrapping up there with Miami. So Miami has, again, been one of those, especially probably depending on where you are, but a little bit better performer relative to other parts of Florida. 24,000 jobs added year to date. Chris, I'm guessing none of those really surprise you?
No, certainly not. Those are the big markets, largest population centers, largest job centers. But, the takeaway specifically with Miami and Dallas, you mentioned their apartment performance is a little bit weaker. I would attribute most of that to the oversupply. But the good news is that the demand will continue to be there. We're continuing to add jobs in both of those markets. Very hot states from a job growth perspective, very hot markets from a job growth perspective. So thinking with my apartment hat on and an operations hat on, it'll really only be a matter of time before those units are absorbed and those rents start to come back into positive territory.
Yeah, I completely agree. I know that in some of the analysis that you've presented, you focused on, while some of the Carolinas have been a little bit rough in terms of performance, Charleston is at the top of the list in terms of relative job gain from the beginning of the year. It and Boise, Idaho are up 1.9% in terms of their job level from the beginning of the year till now. So even if, let's say it's up to 2% at the midpoint, if you double that and you say this year they get 4% job growth, I mean, that's a really, really strong number. So great to see. The next tier just behind those, maybe some surprises, maybe some not. Fayetteville, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, so much smaller metropolitan area. It's there. Kansas City is adding a lot on a relative basis, but Raleigh is right there. And so, a market where I would say, I just posted on LinkedIn, I think one of the, I don't want to call it a highlight, one of the kind of observations, and we covered so many markets and asset classes and or property quality, submarkets, so on, related to multifamily at the NAA. Raleigh's Class A was one that really concerned me looking at the trends. But again, you look at the demand aspect, and it continues to be one of the ones in terms of adding jobs. I think and I'll mention Austin in a second, it's just, maybe not as strong as normally it would be. And then you add on the supply on top of that. And that's why you see in it being a little bit rougher. Las Vegas actually is still showing pretty solid job growth through the first part of this year. And so we'll see if the apartment numbers, I know we've seen it improve compared to where it was. We'll see if, if the demand can stay there and help that market get a bit better. But Las Vegas and Richmond are kind of just the tier right behind it. So again, on a growth perspective, Charleston, Boise, Raleigh, Fayetteville, Casey, Las Vegas, and Richmond are kind of at the top of the list there.
Yeah, and that's good to hear. Charleston has been that market that's really bucked the trend in the Southeast for apartment performance. I know it didn't crack the conversation earlier and didn't crack the top 5 for a number of the metrics that we referenced, but just looking at the data here, revenue's up 4.5% in Charleston, rents are up 3.9% year to date in Charleston. So even though the Southeast gets painted with a broad brush, the Carolinas, high supply, weaker performance, the supply hasn't been quite as high in Charleston. The demand is certainly still there from a job growth perspective. And so you're seeing that real strong outperformance. So those numbers certainly jive with what we're seeing on the multifamily side.
Now, some perspective is you can be towards the top of this list, but again, if these markets aren't growing the way they normally might, then even a strong relative number compared to other markets could end up in some weaker demand for multifamily compared to what you would think. So one of the things that I really dug into was, again, the last 5 months compared to the 5 months before that. And so where did we see some fall off and who's kind of hanging in there? One I would point out, and again, we have a little bit of mixed signals on this market, and it would be San Francisco. So overall, San Francisco has negative year-to-date job growth. I mean, they've actually lost jobs. They have fewer jobs today than they did when the year began. Within that number, though, Oakland is actually positive. And so we are seeing, I know that you've highlighted that, and you just did that, specifically the more downtown Oakland area, while we're seeing, not necessarily apartment performance keeping up with what operators would like, you are seeing traffic, you are seeing leases signed, which is positive. And so it feels like, the numbers are probably better than they could be otherwise, given, what we're seeing there in terms of the underlying job situation. Some that were, some a little bit smaller markets. So in Albuquerque and in Myrtle Beach, last year, they were some really strong markets in the back half of last year in terms of job creation. They've actually been closer to flat this year. So flat is just barely slightly negative, but not really adding a lot of jobs. Again, if that number holds, not a positive sign, because your demand is starting to dwindle, in those markets. And so we've seen, I think maybe a little bit better performance there, specifically within Albuquerque at points, but those would be ones that I would watch out for to see if that trend continues. Some others that are in that range. So these markets are still producing jobs. These three that I'm about to mention, you referenced one earlier. Actually, you referenced two of these earlier. San Antonio, Sacramento, and Riverside. They're all still producing jobs. They're in positive territory, but again, they're about half the pace of job creation the first 5 months of this year compared to the last 5 months of last year. So again, that's not that unusual, given that we have seen the national number start to slow down, because remember, we were still in some really, really hot job gain territory late last year, and the market's now moderating. So these are just some, as the gas pedal comes off just a little bit, that you could see some ebbs and flows in the numbers. And then one last point, and curious of any thoughts you have on any of these, but markets that are still keeping up with the pace that they did towards the end of 2023. Indy is one, and we've seen some better performance in Indy and Midwest. So, it's still kind of maintaining that job creation. Seattle is another. And we've seen Seattle, as you mentioned, that being a little bit better, especially than maybe people think. Believe it or not, Austin is actually creating about the same number of jobs over the last 5 months as it did the 5 months before that. Now, it's the one that I've been referencing that's great. Austin usually creates a lot more jobs than this. When there's generally economic expansion in the U.S., Austin's a stronger job market than it has been. And that's part of the reason that you're seeing some of the weakness in performance overall. So that's kind of the last part, Chris, recap of what's changed over the last several months, maybe compared to the end of 2023. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, no, good insight, Jay. Seattle is a market that I'm kind of keenly focused on. It's an interesting market. It's often been an overflow market from San Francisco, and not to say that it only relies on growth from San Francisco. It's certainly got a robust economy of its own, but it often gets lumped in with San Francisco. And to see kind of the continued job growth across the Seattle metro, I think is good. We've seen good apartment performance coming out of Seattle as well. San Antonio is an interesting one. That's a market from a multifamily perspective that has struggled mightily. Lots of new supply, softening demand. So to see the job numbers hopefully stay where they are, hopefully start to grow again. You said those had kind of flatlined. If they dip further negative, that would be another indication that San Antonio might fall down in the territory of an Austin from a multifamily performance. But no, overall, great insight. I guess one question in terms of the labor market in general, do we typically see seasonality? I know these are seasonally adjusted numbers, but are there certain sectors or certain markets that tend to do better or worse in certain times of the year?
Well, I'll take that question a little bit different route. These numbers are all subject to be revised, and there are ones that we look at, and I think that the real trend, it's coming through our numbers. So our numbers take into account not that we're trying to do it, but the ultimate result is when you look at what's happening with occupancy rates, when you look at what's happening with rents, they're based on what's happening in local economic conditions of how much demand there is, which there are a lot of pieces to that. How many jobs are being created? What's happening in the single family industry? Is that keeping more people in multi? All of that sort of stuff. And then you have the supply side of the equation. When you factor all those in, it's going to come through what happens with rent growth and occupancy rates. And so, many of these are the ones that make a lot of sense. I would say that, yeah, this is, I think the job numbers are probably pretty solid. There are others like in Denver where, we didn't touch on it here, but Denver is actually showing negative job growth right now. I know we've mentioned it several times. Our numbers do not indicate that. The people operating in that market, they're not losing occupancy. Rents are actually going up at a normal type pace. The underlying fundamentals of what we're seeing does not indicate that there's a job problem in Denver at this point. We've dug in and we've looked at different sectors and so on. But the main thing I would say is you're not going to see the Radix numbers and these trends revised because we go back later and we say, well, this is actually what we really believe happened. And so that is the one thing you have to do. The BLS does as good a job as they can, obviously, with these. But we do end up seeing some revisions. And I look at periods like this where we can spot with our numbers where we say, I don't think that doesn't seem right compared to what we believe is a pretty accurate measure of supply and demand in a market.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great point. Great point. So Jay, we'll take a hard right turn here. I know we've talked a lot about the multifamily market, a lot about the jobs market, but it is the week of the 4th of July. What are you up to for the 4th? And give me your favorite 4th of July memory that either from when you were a kid or from years past. What's been one of those 4th of Julys that have really stuck out?
Sure. And that's a wild card question I had not contemplated, but I'm sure I'll come up with an answer. So it's hitting 100 degrees here in Dallas, Fort Worth. I thought, why not crank it up to 110 or 112? So I'm going to Las Vegas for the 4th of July and seeing what's happening out in that place. Of course, I'll be in Scottsdale not long after that. I think I'm just finding the hottest spots in America to spend, the warmest parts of summer. So
you're doing what you can to stress the power grid for all those listeners who tuned in last week.
Apparently now we'll have the AC down, it won't be cranking quite as hard here, but yeah, that's what I'll be doing in terms of favorite memories. Gosh, too many to list, I'm sure, with friends and trips I've taken and all that. If I think back as a kid making homemade ice cream, on the 4th of July, setting firecrackers off too close to myself. That's why I don't let my kids do it. So I would say lots of special memories over the years, but I think spending time with friends, family, great food, all of that. How about you?
Yeah. So this year I'm going to be joining some friends in a golf tournament on the morning of the 4th, and then doing some barbecues and kind of typical 4th of July things, probably eating too many hot dogs and just hanging out. It'll be good to, just be with my family here. And then, thinking back to when I was a kid, the town I grew up in outside of Boston, they had what we called the practice for the Boston Pops fireworks show. I don't know how the connection was made, but they would essentially do most of the big show that they were planning for the Charles River in Boston on the 4th of July. They would kind of rehearse it in our town over the lake on the 3rd of July. So we were fortunate enough to get every year just a fantastic fireworks show. It was top notch. We would be, sitting there on the lake shore and eating smoothie or eating ices and hot dogs and just hanging out and watching, real top notch. And then typically we just watch the Boston Pops and the same fireworks show the next day on TV. So we kind of got to double it up. But you mentioned, being with family, being with friends, there's nothing better, especially on a hot summer day, and a great way to celebrate our country and celebrate each other. So that's what we've got up to this week. Well, thank you to.
I was just going to say, in case you're wondering, I will not be wearing this jacket in Vegas on the 4th, so don't worry about me.
I don't know. I bet you'll see. You'll have to report back how many people you see dressed up like Uncle Sam on the Vegas Strip while you're out there. We could have a fun game setting an over/under with that one.
Will do.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. On behalf of Jay Denton, I'm Chris Nebenzahl. Thanks for your support through the first 10 episodes of this podcast series. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please give us a rating and a review. Any feedback we would love to hear. And thanks again for listening.